We push towards the objective here.
Order the 3rd Company to advance.
October 1942. Western Desert, North Africa. The sand is already warm before the sun fully rises. A low wind drags thin lines across the desert floor, erasing footprints almost as soon as they are made. Somewhere beyond the horizon, engines growl, then fade, then return again, closer this time. Lieutenant Clark stands in a shallow defensive scrape cut into the hard-packed sand. There is no shade, no cover beyond the slight curve of earth in front of him. His uniform is stiff with dust, his boots coated in powder fine enough to work into every seam. He has been awake for hours, watching the desert breathe and listening for movement that might mean the difference between survival and annihilation. This is not a grand battlefield. There are no sweeping formations, no banners, no massed artillery firing in unison. There is only a lone infantry position, a handful of weapons, and a growing certainty that German armor is probing forward once again. October 1942 is a month of tension in North Africa. Both sides know something is coming. Neither knows exactly when. As the sound of engines settles into a steady rhythm, Lieutenant Clark realizes he may be the only thing standing between a Panzer advance and the ground behind him. And the desert, indifferent and endless, offers no place to hide. The moment cannot be understood without the war that led him here. By the autumn of 1942, the war in North Africa had already consumed nearly 2 years of men, machines, and momentum. What began as a secondary theater had hardened into one of the most strategically decisive fronts of the Second World War. The desert, once considered unsuitable for sustained operations, had proven instead to be a vast, unforgiving testing ground for modern mechanized warfare. The origins of this campaign trace back to Italy's entry into the war in June 1940. Benito Mussolini, seeking quick territorial gains, ordered Italian forces in Libya to advance into British-controlled Egypt. The move collapsed almost immediately. Poor planning, inadequate logistics, and low morale left Italian formations vulnerable, and by early 1941 British Commonwealth troops had pushed deep into Cyrenaica, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. Germany intervened to prevent total Axis collapse. In February 1941, the first elements of the Deutsches Afrikakorps arrived under the command of General Erwin Rommel. What was intended as a limited stabilizing force became, under Rommel's aggressive leadership, an instrument of relentless offensive warfare. Using speed, deception, and combined arms tactics, German and Italian units drove British forces back across Libya in a series of seesaw campaigns that defined the Desert War. By mid-1942, Rommel stood at the height of his operational success. After the Battle of Gazala in May and June, Axis forces broke through British defensive lines and captured Tobruk on June 21, 1942. The fall of Tobruk sent shockwaves through London. It opened the road to Egypt and threatened the Suez Canal, the British Empire's most vital artery. For a moment, it appeared that Axis armor might reach Alexandria and Cairo. But victory carried its own penalties. Rommel's advance stretched supply lines to their breaking point. Fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and even water had to be hauled hundreds of miles across desert tracks constantly harassed by Allied air power. Axis ports in Tripoli and Benghazi could not sustain the tempo required for decisive exploitation. Every mile eastward weakened the spearhead. The British Eighth Army, though battered, was not destroyed. After falling back to the narrow bottleneck between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qatar Depression, British forces dug in at El Alamein in July 1942. There, the desert finally imposed limits on maneuver. The front compressed. Flanking movements became impossible. The war shifted from sweeping advances to brutal, grinding confrontations. Leadership on the Allied side also changed. In August 1942, General Bernard Montgomery took command of the Eighth Army. He halted retreat, reorganized formations, improved training, and restored discipline. Units were rotated, defenses strengthened, and supply systems rebuilt. For the first time in months, British forces prepared not merely to survive, but to strike back. As September turned to October, both sides waited. Rommel, ill and exhausted, returned briefly to Germany, leaving his army to hold a precarious line. Montgomery amassed men, tanks, and artillery with deliberate patience. Beneath this strategic tension, thousands of smaller positions stretched across the desert. Outposts, listening posts, infantry strongpoints. These were not places of sweeping maneuvers or decisive breakthroughs. They were places where lieutenants, sergeants, and privates watched the horizon and waited for engines to appear out of the heat haze. It was within this fragile lattice of forward positions that Lieutenant Clark found himself in October 1942, part of a war balanced on the edge of transformation, where even the smallest delay or defense could echo far beyond the sand in front of it. To understand why one man's stand could matter, the realities of desert warfare at the tactical level must be understood. The Western Desert imposed its own rules on the men who fought across it. Maps suggested open space and freedom of movement, but the reality was far more restrictive. Visibility stretched for miles, yet concealment was scarce. The ground, often rock-hard beneath a thin layer of sand, punished both boots and vehicle suspensions. Any movement raised dust plumes that could be seen long before contact was made. In this environment, infantry were both exposed and indispensable. Tanks dominated headlines and command discussions, but armor could not hold ground alone. It was infantry who manned forward positions, secured flanks, and delayed enemy thrusts long enough for reserves to move. These positions were often lightly constructed, scrapes, shallow trenches, or hastily reinforced sangars, offering little protection against artillery or armored assault. Junior officers carried extraordinary responsibility. A lieutenant might command a platoon stretched thin across hundreds of meters, with limited communications and little hope of immediate reinforcement. Radio contact was unreliable. Wire lines were easily cut by shell fire or vehicle movement. Once an engagement began, decisions had to be made quickly, often in isolation. German Panzer doctrine relied on probing attacks as much as full-scale assaults. Armored elements advanced to test enemy strength, locate weak points, and forced premature reactions. If resistance was light, they pressed forward. If resistance proved stubborn, they fixed the enemy in place and maneuvered elsewhere. This made forward Allied positions constant targets, not necessarily for annihilation, but for pressure. Anti-tank defense in 1942 was uneven. Allied infantry units were equipped with a mixture of weapons: Boy's anti-tank rifles, 2-pounder guns, mines, and improvised obstacles. Some were effective only at close range. Others required calm coordination under fire. Against German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, success depended on positioning, discipline, and timing rather than raw firepower. Terrain mattered intensely, even in the desert. Slight rises, shallow depressions, patches of firmer ground, or fields of loose sand could influence the outcome of an engagement. A tank slowed by soft ground became vulnerable. A gun positioned just a few feet lower than the surrounding terrain could remain unseen until the decisive moment. October 1942 saw increased Axis reconnaissance activity. With Allied forces massing behind the lines, German units sought information and opportunities to disrupt preparations. Small armored groups moved forward cautiously, often accompanied by infantry or motorcycle units. Their presence forced Allied commanders to reveal defenses or commit reserves prematurely. For the men in forward positions, this meant long hours of waiting punctuated by sudden violence. There was little warning. The first sign of contact was often the sound of engines or the glint of sunlight on metal. Once armor appeared, choices narrowed rapidly. Withdrawal could expose gaps. Resistance risked encirclement or destruction. Lieutenant Clark operated within this reality. He did not command tanks or artillery. He commanded a piece of ground, valuable not for what it offered, but for what lay behind it. His role was not to win a battle, but to hold, delay, and deny. In desert warfare, time was a weapon. Every minute an armored column was slowed, allowed artillery to reposition, reserves to mobilize, and plans to remain intact. As German armor moved forward once more in October 1942, the war's vast strategies narrowed down to individual positions and individual decisions. In that narrowing space, Lieutenant Clark's situation became less about doctrine and more about human endurance under pressure. From this foundation, the story must be viewed through the different lenses that shaped the moment itself. Desert warfare exhausted the body before the enemy ever appeared. Water was rationed. Sleep came in fragments, broken by heat during the day and cold at night. Sand worked its way into weapons, eyes, and lungs. For an infantry officer, fatigue was not simply personal. It radiated outward. Men looked to their lieutenant not for speeches, but for signs of steadiness. A calm posture, a measured tone, or even silence could anchor a unit when fear threatened to unravel it. Lieutenant Clark's isolation amplified this burden. Without the reassurance of nearby formations, uncertainty multiplied. Every sound carried meaning. Every delay felt deliberate. He could not know whether support was minutes away or hours beyond reach. In such moments, leadership became less about orders and more about presence, remaining visible, controlled, and focused while the desert closed in. Tactically, holding ground against armor demanded restraint. firing too early revealed positions. Firing too late risked being overrun. Anti-tank weapons required overlapping fields of fire, careful concealment, and clear arcs. Mines had to be placed precisely. Any mistake could render a defense useless. Clark's task was not to destroy tanks outright, but to force them to hesitate. A halted panzer was a vulnerable panzer. Smoke, dust, and confusion could fracture an armored advance as effectively as heavy guns. Even a single damaged vehicle could block movement in the tight desert approaches, creating uncertainty for those behind it. Technology shaped expectations but did not guarantee outcomes. German armor was reliable, well-coordinated, and backed by doctrine refined in Europe. Allied infantry weapons lagged in power, but compensated through improvisation. Camouflage netting, sand-colored coverings, and the careful sighting of guns turned simple equipment into effective tools. Radio sets, when functional, provided lifelines. When they failed, runners crossed open ground under fire. The desert magnified these vulnerabilities. Machines overheated. Lubricants failed. Small malfunctions carried enormous consequences. In October 1942, technology offered possibilities, but survival still depended on judgment, timing, and resolve. Those qualities would be tested as German armor moved closer, and Lieutenant Clark's narrow strip of desert became the focus of converging forces. Other perspectives, those of command, the enemy, and the moral weight of resistance, now come into view. Leadership at the platoon level in North Africa was stripped of ceremony. There were no elaborate plans to consult once contact began. A lieutenant's authority rested on preparation done long before the first tank appeared. Fields of fire had to be memorized. Ranges estimated. Contingencies considered in quiet moments before dawn. Lieutenant Clark's responsibility extended beyond tactical choices. He had to judge when to commit his men and when to preserve them. Ordering resistance too long could lead to annihilation. Ordering withdrawal too soon could expose a wider formation. There was no perfect balance, only informed judgment shaped by experience and instinct. In the desert, leadership also meant absorbing fear. Officers were expected to remain exposed, moving between positions, checking weapons, correcting aim, even as incoming fire sought them out. Visibility made concealment difficult. Courage was not abstract, it was observable. From the German perspective, forward Allied positions were obstacles, not objectives. Panzer commanders evaluated resistance quickly. If a position appeared weak, they advanced decisively. If it resisted effectively, they reconsidered, called for support, or shifted direction. Speed was doctrine, but flexibility was survival. German crews were trained to expect scattered resistance, not determined isolation. A single position holding firm could suggest a larger defensive network behind it. Uncertainty slowed momentum. Even brief hesitation disrupted synchronization between armor, infantry, and artillery. In October 1942, German units operated under increasing strain. Fuel shortages limited maneuver. Replacement crews lacked the experience of earlier campaigns. Every engagement risked attrition they could ill afford. A stubborn defense, even by a small force, carried disproportionate weight. Morally, holding ground alone imposed a heavy burden. The desert offered no witnesses no immediate recognition. Actions were recorded later, if at all, through reports and fragmented accounts. Yet the decision to resist was not abstract. It involved weighing survival against duty, individual life against collective necessity. For Lieutenant Clark, the choice to stand was shaped not by glory, but by obligation. The ground behind him mattered. Others depended on time he could buy. In mechanized warfare, morality often appeared in these quiet decisions, whether to hold when withdrawal was possible, whether to expose oneself to fire to steady others. As German armor continued its advance, these perspectives converged. Leadership, enemy intent, and moral resolve tightened around a single point in the desert. The moment of decision approached, and with it, the turning point that would define the engagement. The war now narrowed to minutes, meters, and irrevocable choices. The first Panzer appears as a dark shape against the pale horizon. Then another. Then the unmistakable line of movement that signals an armored probe rather than a patrol. It is mid-morning in October 1942. The sun has climbed high enough to flatten shadows, making distance difficult to judge. Heat shimmer blurs outlines, but the sound carries clearly. Engines throttling up, gears shifting, tracks grinding against stone beneath the sand. Lieutenant Clark watches through binoculars, forcing himself to count rather than guess. German tanks rarely advanced alone. He scans for accompanying infantry, support vehicles, or the telltale spacing that suggests a coordinated push. The formation is cautious, deliberate. This is not a charge. It is a test. He signals his men to remain still. Weapons are kept low. Anti-tank positions stay silent. Dust rises as the panzers close the distance, then settles again. Every second stretches. Opening fire too early would allow the tanks to halt beyond effective range and call in artillery. Waiting too long risks allowing them to overrun the position entirely. As the lead tank reaches a slight rise, its silhouette sharpens. It pauses. The commander's hatch opens briefly. A figure scans the ground ahead, unaware of the shallow defensive works lying just beyond his view. The tank inches forward again. Clark makes a final check. Fields of fire overlap. Escape routes are minimal. There will be no second chance. When he gives the order, the engagement will commit everyone present. The first shot breaks the desert stillness like a physical blow. Anti-tank fire slams into the lead panzer, throwing up a burst of dust and metal fragments. Almost instantly, return fire follows. High explosive rounds tear into the sand, collapsing sections of earthwork and filling the air with choking grit. German tanks fan out, seeking angles. Machine gun fire rakes the position. The desert, moments earlier empty and vast, contracts into a violent, confined space. Clark moves between positions, shouting short commands, correcting aim, dragging wounded men into cover. Time loses coherence. Minutes feel like seconds. Seconds stretch into something heavier. The tanks continue to advance, then hesitate, unsure whether they face a lone strong point or the edge of a deeper defensive belt. It is here, in this narrowing window, that the engagement's outcome begins to take shape But the most critical moment is still ahead. The next phase will determine whether the position holds or is erased from the desert altogether. The German advance slows, then fractures. One panzer halts abruptly, its crew reacting to damage or uncertainty. Another swings wide, attempting to flank the position, its tracks cutting a hard arc through the sand. Dust clouds thicken, obscuring clear lines of sight. The engagement becomes a series of violent flashes rather than a continuous picture. Lieutenant Clark recognizes the shift immediately. The panzers are no longer probing. They're assessing cost. He orders fire held on one sector and concentrated on another, forcing the armor to respond rather than dictate movement. A second anti-tank round strikes close to a vehicle's lower hull. Whether it penetrates or merely shocks the crew is impossible to tell, but the effect is visible. The tank reverses awkwardly, momentarily blocking the path of those behind it. German machine gun fire intensifies. Tracers cut low arcs across the ground, snapping over the shallow defenses. Explosions collapse more sand into the positions, narrowing what little protection remains. Communications fail. Orders are now given by gesture, by proximity, by instinct. Clark remains exposed longer than prudence would suggest. He knows visibility matters. If he disappears, uncertainty will spread faster than fear. He moves from weapon to weapon, adjusting fire, urging restraint when ammunition runs low, pressing urgency when tanks begin to edge forward again. The enemy hesitates once more. Smoke hangs unevenly, catching the light. A panzer commander cannot see beyond the immediate contact zone. He cannot confirm the absence of additional guns. To push forward risks losses that may not be justified by the ground gained. After what feels like an eternity, but is likely only minutes, the German formation begins to withdraw. One tank covers the movement of another. Engines rev, then turn away. The dust cloud shifts direction, drifting back toward the horizon from which it came. The desert falls into a tense silence, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the labored breathing of men who have not yet processed that the attack has ended. The position still stands. The ground remains held. Lieutenant Clark does not celebrate. He checks casualties. He confirms ammunition counts. He scans the horizon for a renewed assault. In desert warfare, survival is never final. Yet something has changed. A panzer advance has been delayed. Time has been gained. And in October 1942, on the eve of a decisive Allied offensive, time is the most valuable commodity of all. What follows will reveal how such moments echo beyond the narrow strip of sand where they occur. When the dust finally settles, the desert reveals the cost of the encounter in quiet fragments. Shattered equipment lies half buried where explosions collapse the earthworks. Spent shell casings are scattered in uneven patterns, marking where men stood and fought. The air smells of cordite, hot metal, and disturbed sand baked again by the sun. Lieutenant Clark conducts a methodical assessment. Wounded men are identified first. Bleeding is stopped where possible. Those able to move assist those who cannot. There is no medical convoy waiting nearby, no dramatic evacuation. Casualties must be stabilized and held until darkness or relief makes movement possible. In the desert, even survival carries logistical weight. Reports are compiled as best they can be. Distances estimated. Enemy numbers approximated. Times reconstructed from memory rather than clocks. Such reports will later be filtered, condensed, and placed into larger operational summaries, their human intensity reduced to lines of text. Yet these lines matter. They inform command decisions about enemy intent, strength, and direction. The German withdrawal does not mean defeat. It means recalculation. Axis units have learned that this sector is defended more firmly than expected. Any renewed advance will require additional resources, artillery, infantry support, or a shift in axis of attack. Each requirement costs time and fuel, both already in short supply. For the Allied side, the defense confirms that forward positions can hold if properly led and sighted. It reinforces Montgomery's emphasis on discipline and preparation. Individual stands, when multiplied across the front, create a defensive depth that armor alone cannot easily breach. Lieutenant Clark's position remains on alert. Ammunition is redistributed. Weapons are cleaned as thoroughly as conditions allow. Lookouts are doubled. No one assumes the engagement is over. In North Africa, attacks often came in waves separated by hours or days, designed to exploit fatigue as much as weakness. Yet the ground remains in Allied hands. Communications, once restored, confirm that other positions have also held. The German probes, though aggressive, have failed to rupture the line. This moment, unremarkable on maps, feeds into a growing pattern. Axis forces are being slowed, checked, and forced into defensive postures. The momentum that once defined Rommel's campaigns is thinning. To understand the full significance of this delay, the wider operational picture must now be considered. The significance of Lieutenant Clark's stand only becomes fully visible when placed against the wider rhythm of October 1942. Across the El Alamein front, Axis forces were increasingly constrained by shortages they could neither conceal nor solve. Fuel allocations were calculated down to hours of movement. Replacement vehicles arrived sporadically, often, damaged before reaching the front. Air superiority had begun to tilt decisively in the Allies' favor, further complicating German logistics. Every delayed probe forced German commanders to revise timetables. An armored thrust postponed here required compensatory action elsewhere. Artillery diverted to suppress one stubborn position could not support another. In a campaign defined by maneuver, friction accumulated quickly. On the Allied side, defensive successes reinforced a growing confidence that had been absent earlier in the year. Montgomery's insistence on holding ground, refusing unnecessary withdrawals, An imposing clear command discipline began to pay dividends. The Eighth Army was no longer reacting. It was absorbing pressure and shaping the battlefield. Small unit actions fed into intelligence assessments. Reports of German caution, of limited armored groups testing rather than committing, confirmed suspicions that Rommel's forces were no longer capable of sustained offensive operations. This information mattered. It shaped the timing and confidence behind the Allied offensive that would soon begin. That offensive, launched on the night of October 23, 1942, would mark the Second Battle of El Alamein. It would become one of the decisive turning points of the war, forcing Axis forces into a retreat from which they would never fully recover. The preparation for that assault depended on time, secrecy, and the maintenance of intact defensive lines. Lieutenant Clark's engagement did not decide El Alamein. It did something quieter but no less essential. It preserved continuity. It denied the enemy information. It prevented premature commitment of Allied reserves. In warfare, especially modern warfare, such preservation is a form of victory. After the offensive began, many forward positions were relieved, repositioned, or absorbed into advancing formations. Individual actions faded into the larger narrative of tanks, artillery barges, and sweeping movements westward. Yet the foundation of that narrative rested on countless moments where ground was held under pressure. The desert remembers none of this. Wind erases tracks. Sand covers scars. But in October 1942, before the thunder of mass guns signaled a turning of the tide, isolated positions like Clark's helped ensure that when the moment came, the Allied line was unbroken. With the battle's outcome secured, what remains is to consider what such moments mean within the broader history of war. In the vast sweep of the North African desert, a single defensive position can appear insignificant. Yet moments like Lieutenant Clark's stand in October 1942 reveal how individual decisions ripple through larger conflicts. One officer, one platoon, can influence tempo, delay momentum, and shape the options available to commanders far beyond their line of sight. Desert warfare demanded more than firepower. It demanded endurance, judgment, and an understanding of the fragile interplay between terrain, technology, and human will. Soldiers were tested not only by the enemy, but by the environment itself. Heat, sand, and isolation were as unforgiving as any armored assault. Leadership in such conditions was measured in patience and presence, in small acts of control amid chaos, and in the ability to make the right decision under extreme uncertainty. Clark's stand exemplifies this principle. It was not a grand battle, nor a moment that dominates history books. Yet it contributed to the integrity of the defensive line, the preservation of time and space for strategic planning, and ultimately the success of the Allied offensive at El Alamein. In war, these incremental victories, the ones without immediate fanfare, often prove decisive when viewed in the context of campaigns and strategy. Beyond military significance, such moments offer insight into human resilience. The ability to confront overwhelming odds, to hold despite isolation, and to act with discipline under fear is a universal testament to endurance under pressure. In the deserts of North Africa, the interplay of machine and man, of strategy and improvisation, was laid bare. And in that crucible, Lieutenant Clark's decision to hold ground demonstrates that history is shaped not only by armies and generals, but by those who stand when the outcome is uncertain. The desert may forget, the maps may not mark it, yet in the quiet calculus of survival and strategy, small acts of resolve become the invisible architecture of victory. The sands of North Africa do not tell stories, they only witness them. And in October 1942, one witness saw a stand that mattered far beyond its immediate horizon.